Welcome all to Legal Tech Week for June 5th, 2028, 6th, and 28, whatever. Um, this is the show where we talk about the top stories in legal tech and innovation from the past week. And as you see, we have an intimate panel here today. We are expecting one more panelist and hope she shows up because she had a good story I want to talk about. But as for me, I'm Bob Ambrogi, and I write a blog called Law Sites, and I have a podcast called Law Next. And among our many panelists today, Steve, why don't you kick it off?
Hi, Steve Embry here. I write the blog Tech Law Crossroads and write for Above the Law and on occasion for ABA's Law Technology Today.
All right, and Joe.
And I'm Joe Patrice. I'm the senior editor at Above. Yeah, you can hear me? Oh, okay.
Yeah, we
At
hear you.
Above the Law. Okay, good. At Above the Law, I have a podcast called Thinking Like a Lawyer in addition to this show. And I am not at home because I am attending the Netroots Nation conference where there was just a Supreme Court reform panel that I covered, which was exciting because some of you know Ellie Mistal. He was on the panel and he was as entertaining as he ever is, So like just broke the other panelists with some of the jokes he was telling. So
I haven't seen Ellie in like pretty
yeah,
much since he left Above the Law. I think it's been a while since I've seen him. I don't know, maybe I run into him here and there, but
yeah. I
miss
mean,
seeing him. He's fun.
he is. Well, and that's the thing. He doesn't cover the tech side of law. Like I have my tentacles everywhere. He just kind of covers the courts and justice now. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, and he never really did cover the tech side of law, but still, when
yeah,
he was at Above the Law, you'd run into him here and there, and
yeah, we'd have
the
events
occasional
and yeah,
bar, or
yeah.
at least, if nothing else. All right. Well, our audience of note takers is quickly assembling, so we're going to need to do something. We need to talk about something for them to take notes on and give us a summary of at the end.
We're,
But
we're soon gonna have more note takers than we have human attendees.
yeah, well, we already have more note takers than we have panelists, I think. So uh, we're
Taking over the
outnumbered
world.
as it is. Where's Stephanie? All right. Well, we don't have Stephanie, so I don't know. Where do you want us to? I have a lot of stuff to talk about. Panelists, tell us about your. I mean, the audience, tell us about your week and in the chat. Is the chat even working? I'm hardly seeing anybody in the chat today. Somebody say hello if you're in the chat and reassure us that it's working. Um, so yeah, so I mean, maybe Steve, we could just kind of talk about your conference experience this week, just to kind of
Yeah,
kick it off, because
sure,
you got to go to
absolutely.
Legal Geek and sounded like a
Yep.
good conference.
I went to Legal Geek, which was in a one-day conference in Chicago. This second year that I've been, and I have to say it's really a pretty cool conference. It About 1,000 attendees, I would say, a lot of probably bigger law folks, but not exclusively. But the thing that I really like about it is the speakers are given 10 minutes to give their presentation. And it runs like that. They'll do like five in an hour, just 15 minutes, and they'll take a break, and then they'll do. And it's really cool because they have to be very focused, and they really don't get 10 minutes. They really get 8 minutes. So there's none of this getting up on the stage and talking about how great they are and what they did this, and how they did that. Very few of them used PowerPoint presentations. Some had a few, token slides. You can't use very many in 8 minutes, obviously.
Right.
And the venue is really cool. It's a big they have a big courtyard, open air courtyard, and then the vendors are at small tables in an open air area adjacent to that courtyard. So it's very kind of outdoorsy feel, and it was helped by the fact that it was really nice weather for Chicago. Wasn't hot. A lot of presentations were on sort of practical things about AI and how to deal with vendors was one that I thought was really good. It was a presentation by Thomson Reuters venture capital guy that was good. A lot of talk about AI first law firms and how they're doing things. And it was good. It was quite good. I had a good time. Learned a lot of stuff. I've got one article just dropped on it. I've got another one coming out probably next week. The biggest issue walking in, I think, was AOM or whatever it's called, Centrella, I think it is, uh, purchased Legal Geek late last year. And so the issue was really, how's that going to change? Is it going to change? Um, and of course, nothing changed this year. Probably because the venue was already booked. I couldn't tell any real difference in the speakers. There weren't. Gina Passarella spoke early on in the conference. Gave a nice presentation. Wasn't Didn't promote ALM or whatever they are.
Or whatever
Um,
they are now.
yeah, whatever they are.
Citronella.
They're
So yeah,
Centinela.
yeah,
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
their name did not appear
Yeah.
anyplace that I saw in any of the literature. Certainly wasn't, you know, posted on a big screen or anything like that. Um, I did notice a little quote on the Legal Geek website about the acquisition, saying it will enable us to grow, and that made me wonder, if the thing that's so unique and nice about the conference is it is small. I mean, with a thousand people, it didn't seem like there were 1,000 people there. That 1,000 people registered, but that's what makes it kind of nice. And the ILTA's Evolve conference sort of, it was small the first few years, and then this year it was bigger, and it kind of lost a little bit of that sort of informality, I think. At this year's conference, which was at the Gaylord in Denver. Um, Joy Heath Rush gave the final talk of the day and did a really nice job, sort of summarizing all the themes and what had been discussed and where we are and all that kind of stuff. So it was a nice time. Got to see a Cubs game and had some fun, and all in all, it was a good try. I think it's assuming it kind of stays like it is and doesn't morph into something else. I think it's well worthwhile. If nothing else, to watch these speakers have to give an 8-minute presentation and have enough substance in it to keep everybody's interest and attention. So that was cool to see, and they most of them did a very good job. One or two of them, I don't know how they applied the hook, but nobody went over. So they must have had some, prod stuck to them or something that they gave them a shock when it was about time was up. But I think I think last year I learned that they do make them practice and do run throughs in advance to make sure that they're not going to go over. And um, but it was good. I was glad I went.
I definitely have done that format before, and it is a lot of fun. It is very stressful to get everything
Yeah,
in those short periods, but very fun.
and interesting. I'm in another organization. It's a trial lawyers organization, and they had a conference last year, and they just got so sick of what these hotels and convention centers are charging for AV equipment that they just said, no PowerPoints. You're on your own. No PowerPoints. And saved a ton of money. And the presentation, frankly, were just as good, I thought. I mean, because most PowerPoints, I mean, let's face it, most of them are just like ugh, junk.
I mean, now you get your AI to make your PowerPoints for you too. So
Yeah, right. Be even worse.
yeah.
So trying to think of a couple of times recently, I've been in some conferences where they've had not a whole day, but where they've had segments that are the rapid fire, 10-minute whatever talks like that. And sometimes they can be really good. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they feel like the presenter is trying so hard to be clever and concise all at the same time that it starts to feel a little forced or a little artificially abbreviated or something. I mean, I've seen those go both ways, but when they
Hmm.
go well, they go really well. They can be a really good way to do it. I've never been to a
And
conference that had a full day of it like that. I've never been to Legal
they,
Week, so
well, and I should make hasten to add that the rapid fire things were not the whole day.
Oh, they're not.
They had all morning were rapid fire, and then after lunch they had like roundtable discussions
Oh, good.
on various topics, and then like the end last 2 hours of the conference were rapid fire. Um, and they had really good speakers, I thought. I knew some of them, but not all of them, but they were pretty impressive lot. And they did good work with the stuff. They also have a couple of side rooms that they have presentations going on where vendors can give their presentations and various discussions kind of things. I didn't go to any of those, but they looked kind of interesting, and so that was also going on at the same time. Lots of breaks for networking. They really stress, you know, meeting people and how many people here met 5 people during the break, and a lot of high five kind of stuff going on. So they really, some of that can be a little, I don't know, goofy, but it went off okay. I mean, it wasn't too bad. So
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. So yeah,
Well,
who knows?
do we want to talk? Do we want to talk real quick about the story that none of us actually wrote, but is still kind of interesting,
We
that you
can,
brought
and
up?
yeah, and we've
Yeah.
got other stories to talk about, but yeah, we can
Okay,
talk
good.
about that. Yeah, do you want to bring it up? Or
Yeah, sure. I'll make this mine. I didn't get a chance to write this up, but this week we learned that Kirkland is building an AI platform with the help of Palantir. So fresh off of tapping everyone's phones and kidnapping people in the middle of the night, Palantir is going to run private equity work too. So that's exciting. And it it's an interesting development from my perspective, seeing it because if Kirkland wants to build their own thing, which that is a big development in and of itself, that they feel they are of a size that they want their own thing and not what everybody else has. Uh, one, two, they chose who they chose to work with is different too. They, you know, like at the end of a flight, you have many options for who you want to work with in AI, and you don't, but you have a handful of them. And they did not make that choice. They went to the national security side of things, which I thought was, a little worrying too. I mean, I responded to it with just a picture of Saruman and Sauron working together in Lord of the Rings. I feel like that kind of sums up my feelings about Kirkland and Palantir getting together. But hey, what did everybody else think about this? Was really my question because I saw it. It was a big thing, but I was too busy to really dig into it.
yeah, I don't know much
I
about it either. I saw what I read on Artificial Lawyer had a piece about it maybe just yesterday or day before, and that's really all I know about it. My initial reaction though was to kind of say, "Whoa," uh, only because there has been so much focus of late on the potential relationship between Thomson Reuters and Palantir, which Thomson Reuters keeps saying we don't have that relationship. But with regard to the data being used by ICE, and I wrote about this a few times, but they're the sort of the advocates who are pushing Thomson Reuters to be more transparent about their contracts with ICE are saying that uh, ICE is taking that that Thomson Reuters data and combining it with Palantir technology to create this sort of hyper snooping module that gives ICE just unprecedented insight into the personal lives of every citizen in the United States. And Thomson Reuters says, well, our data does not integrate with Palantir. But then if you look at some of the contracts that some of the requisites that ICE has put out in terms of their contracts with Thomson Reuters, they talk about the fact that the data has to be interoperable with these other platforms, and so there's this whole question of to what extent is Palantir already sort of facilitating the dissemination of our data. And so I don't know. So then, if you start working with a major law firm and helping them develop their artificial intelligence platform, um, it just starts to feel creepy. I mean, I have no
hmm
reason
Yeah.
necessarily to think that there's something going to happen, but it just starts to feel really creepy.
yeah. That's kind of my reaction to it as well. Although I think last week we talked a little bit about it's fairly unusual for a law firm to invest in this kind of thing at that level. Because usually, I mean, partners want their payout at the end of the year and they don't want to leave money on the table. But I guess when you're as big as Kirkland is, 500 million doesn't impact the $40 million draw of any particular partner. So maybe they're all cool with that. But it does. I don't know much about it either, but it does seem just slimy and creepy. I think that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, I guess it also kind of raises the question, if they are going to work with a company such as Palantir, why Palantir and why not one of the major frontier models?
Right.
I mean, since they kind of made a big deal out of saying we're not going to kind of co-develop with OpenAI or Anthropic,
Yeah.
what advantage do they get out of doing this with Palantir as an alternative?
It's,
Again, I'm not
yeah,
sure.
it seems like it's one of those things where you're not going to gain much from it, but it really has a greater propensity to lose something because some clients may be like us and say we really don't want to have our data and confidential material and all that in a system that have been developed by people like these. So it's hard to see how it would be. It's an advantage to do it. I can see how it might end up being a disadvantage.
Yeah.
I I assume they have some business relationship beyond this. I'm like
Yeah,
maybe Kirkland are their lawyers. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
that's also probably likely,
yeah.
as
It did
in
it.
big client of the firm.
Yeah, maybe. Um, but it did also. So the story I was going to talk about this week, well, I had a couple to talk about.
Yeah.
One was this platform Lavern that I wrote about, which
Is
is
it
kind of the
is it
exact.
is it go, does it come with Shirley, Laverne and Shirley?
Yeah.
Did you see my headline?
No,
My
I
headline
didn't.
was my headline was Can a legal AI platform be powerful, fun, and free all at the same time? Laverne surely thinks so.
Mm.
uh, but we do have to realize that there's probably a considerable number of people in the audience that have no freaking idea what we're talking about right
Well, that's I figured. I mean, I was actually curious whether anybody would pick up on it, but so far nobody has. But it's okay. Um, but when you talk, you think about Kirkland spending all this money to build their large language model, their platform, when there is suddenly this whole slew of these basically enterprising individuals who are putting out either vibe coding or directly coding. Probably probably nobody directly codes anything anymore. Uh, but these platforms that a lot of them kind of promise to be almost as powerful or just as powerful as some of the big names out there. I mean, um, this guy, we talked. I think we talked about Mike OSS in another show, but Laverne is kind of a similar idea. What's really fun about it is that the guy who developed it, Antti Iranen, I may not be pronouncing his name right. He's actually from Finland but lives in Spain. But he's been kind of having fun with it. He is a former law firm founder, and he was a founder of this firm in Helsinki. That one of the characteristics of the firm was that they made a point of kind of having case teams that were made up not just of lawyers but of a mix of professionals with different insights and different skills. And so. He wanted to try and develop a legal system, a legal platform that mimicked that approach. So Laverne is what he calls a multi-agent legal system, where essentially you go in and it's like playing. There's like playing cards. It's like this. You can like pick your team. Um, I think there was what's the NBA? game where you kind of go in any number of games
82 and
like that.
0.
Maybe, yeah,
80.
whatever.
Yeah, that's
Is
going
that the one where
crazy
you go
now.
in and pick your team? And yeah, I mean, there's a bunch, obviously a number of games like that, but it's sort of like that idea where you get kind of playing cards with different skills, different prices, and you go in and pick your team, and you submit when you submit a, a project to it or a question to it. I mean, you can either just kind of do it the normal way of just dropping something in, but you can also go through the sort of the more sophisticated approach where you assemble your team. Your team gets together and kind of conducts this intake, asking you questions about the matter, trying to flesh it out. And then the agents kind of go to work, kind of like arguing with each other, researching and arguing with each other, and presenting cases and counter cases and whatever until it all gets kind of pulled together into a response. And there are various ways you can kind of set the extent to which you want humans in the loop and where you want humans in the loop and all of that. But he's actually even got a little tool that's built into this where he invites you to kind of compare it against Lagora or Harvey in terms of the results it generates, and he claims that he generally beats them at their own game on a regular basis. Um, it's kind of a fun. I haven't actually used it. We had a very very extensive demo of it, in which he's demoed it for me. But it's all open source. It's all up on GitHub. He does not want to kind of make it a commercial product himself. He's said he's too old for that, I think was his quote,
Uh-huh.
and doesn't want the founder lifestyle of jetting around the world all the time and all of that. But he invites anybody to fork it off on GitHub and run with it and do what they want to do with it. Um, and it's, to me, it's just so interesting because we're just starting to see. I mean, this is an interesting approach to it and a fun approach to it. And I hope people will read the story and just go to his. I mean, lots of documentation on the GitHub repo that you can read through and learn more about it. But uh, even as Harvey and Lagora get bigger and bigger, we're seeing these enterprising, individuals for the most part who are going out and trying to build systems that in many ways replicate what those big founders are doing and making them available on an open source basis. And Mike OSS is also open source, I'm pretty sure. And there's a couple of others out there as well that I'm not thinking of right now. So we're in an interesting place right now in terms of tech. It's almost like there's this like rebel movement of people who want to put the tech out there for free and let other people build on it rather than have to pay tons of money for a subscription from a major provider.
Yeah, what's the computer operating system that was developed open source way back when? Linux,
Linux,
something like that.
yeah,
Yeah,
Linux, yeah.
Linux. Yeah, yeah. It was kind of. I was thinking it was kind of a similar thing happening. I mean, vendors were developing operating systems and they reached a certain point, and then the open source idea took hold and did pretty well.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because it does. I was actually thinking how it does kind of remind me of like the earlier days of the internet when
Yeah.
there was this sort of rebel is not the right word. I'm not sure what I'm trying to think of, but there was this sort of anarchic atmosphere around it of people developing tools and putting them out for free for anybody to use. And this whole idea about sort of democratizing tech and democratizing knowledge and democratizing information. And then along came AOL and others, and the whole enshittification started.
Yeah.
Um, so something. All right. Live time.
Nice weather we've been having,
We're
isn't
doing
it?
Yeah. Well, so actually something
How
I
about
think.
those Knicks?
Yeah.
How about that? Okay, we can talk about that. So, but actually, one other story that I had that it's sort of like weirdly loosely related was the news this week about the original founder of Ironclad and the CEO of Ironclad until last year going to OpenAI, because again, it's another um, another fork, I guess. That word is in my head, I think. In this like this increasingly competitive space around legal AI, in which we're starting to see, on one hand, we've got these startups coming out of nowhere like Lavern and Mike. On the other hand, we've got the Harveys and the Lagoras of the world. And then we've got the whole Anthropic thing. And now OpenAI is very, clearly with the hiring of Jason Boehmig, making a big push into legal. And we are going to see a free for all, I think, coming up
Mhm.
over the next 6 months to a year in terms of what these different companies are doing. And it's going to be fascinating to see how it plays out, and whether there are winners and losers in whatever is to come.
Yeah.
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 I mean,
One of the,
yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
No, go for it.
Oh, you go first. I was going to say something dumb. So,
I mean, I was too. Yeah. Obviously, this was interesting because we've danced around this idea that the big players coming into law, and then they do, and then we all kind of hear people say, it's not good enough. And, they're like, maybe, but they're committed. They're going to do this.
I think that's
They
right. Yeah.
they're making clear that that's what they are investing in. So
Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
the
And,
case. Yeah,
this,
go ahead.
it's
Go
interesting
ahead.
because, what was it, a year or so ago, there was that podcast with the Harvey founders, and that they were asked, what are you most worried about? And it was exactly this.
yeah,
And they maybe were worried about other things now, but that they were concerned that OpenAI would swoop in. So, then of course they had a lot of, but that won't happen, and we'll do this, and we'll protect it, and we'll build a moat, and we'll do this and that and the other. But it's it's obviously where they're headed.
yeah,
Yeah, and I think in the case of OpenAI, as I understand it, uh, and again, I credit Artificial Lawyer. I think he had an article on this a couple of weeks ago about them getting more into legal even before
Mm.
Boehmic's news was announced. But I think in that article he talked about, from what he understands, their strategy is to kind of go deeper into a bunch of verticals. It's not just legal,
yeah,
um, and that makes sense that they become more vertical focused across a number of major industries, and I can see that. The Anthropic, the Anthropic's side, they keep talking about the fact that legal has been such a big user of their products, and
yeah,
that with Claude Code in particular. I mean, I think we talked about this a couple weeks ago, that one of the biggest user groups supposedly of Claude Code has been people in the legal profession. Um, Very interesting, right? I don't know. For a profession that has this reputation as always being slow to adopt technology, or laggards when it comes to adopting technology, that's not happening anymore.
It's interesting you say that, but Bob, because at the presentations at Legal Geek, well, one of them was actually Gina Pascarella's presentation was focusing on the fact that these new ways of getting work done with OpenAI and Anthropic are very appealing to the business people in the businesses, who are then putting pressure on in-house counsel, like, you got to do more with less, and you got to start managing the legal fees and outside counsel much better, because these tools will enable you to do so much more. And her view was that a lot of the law firms are blind to the fact that with these increased tools and increased vehicles for getting work done, that they're not going to be able to just continue to jack up rates and continue to do things like they've been doing them over the years. And one of the things she cited, which I thought was interesting, was that particularly big law, I think she was probably referring to Am Law 100 or Am Law 50, that are hiring associates out of law school in record numbers, and they're not really um, thinking about the fact that with artificial intelligence, they may not need quite so many associates, but as she put it, they don't want to leave any money off on the table, which I kind of sort of summed up, a lot of the attitudes that she was talking about. And if anybody's interested, I just wrote an article on this that appeared in Above the Law, and talking about her conclusions, which were pretty interesting.
That said, we did get an article today that hiring of young associates was flat year over year. It did not go up. The article makes pains to say, "Don't blame AI for this yet." But I mean, that's what we expect to see. And this also, we had a report a week earlier that for the first time in years and years and years, big law the AmLaw 100 firms hired more laterals than they did new hires, like out of law school, which that's going to be another domino that falls in this rethinking how the work model goes, because at a certain point, some of these firms are going to decide that the brute force tasks they could give these juniors to justify their existence are going to disappear. And then it's just going to be a lateral hiring game all the way.
Well, and
all the
that
way
that
up
makes
and
sense
down.
with
Yeah.
the AI, with a lot of the AI first firms. They obviously they have no use for associates,
Yeah.
or inexperienced lawyers. I should say they want experienced lawyers that can use these tools. And I saw that headline that you mentioned, Joe, about the numbers dropping, and I wondered how that, if I'd seen that when I was at Legal Geek, I would have asked Gina about that, because she was very definitive about, and I don't know what she was citing. I assume it's some ALM research that they'd done. But
Well, and this was ALM too, so I think they're fighting. They must be
and
fighting.
of course, a lot of it probably depends on the segment of the market that you're looking
Yeah.
at too. I mean, if you look at it overall, AmLaw 200 firms, that's much different than if you're focusing on, AmLaw 50. So
Yeah.
Of course, their head of research just left, so maybe
That's
their
true.
maybe their data is falling out of date.
all right.
Um,
Yeah, it was the National Law Journal who published the one I'm thinking of.
Oh, there you go.
Little intramural infighting, right, Bob?
yeah, except I think that all these days runs through that same research
Oh yeah.
division. It's all perform. It used to be like when I used to be at the National Law Journal. It was like we had our own research team, and the American Lawyer had their own research team, and it was a whole different thing. But
Hmm. Oh,
those were headier days with a little more money in the budget. Um, all right, so who is going to win the NBA final?
So for everyone watching, we're all sitting here waiting for Stephanie, because we're going to talk about her story, and she's just not shown up or given us any indication of why she hasn't. So
well, I still have a story to talk about.
Oh,
So,
you do?
You
Okay.
do?
Oh,
You got
all
another
right.
one?
Okay.
Did we
yeah,
did we
the
didn't
one
do? Oh, we didn't. Oh, that's right. We started with you, and then I forgot we didn't do your story.
Yeah. So the story
Thank
that I put
God.
in, yeah, I can blabber about this for maybe 5 full minutes, but I did think it was a lawsuit filed against the Wiley Ryan firm, which is a AmLaw 200 firm. They do a lot of insurance coverage and regulatory kind of work, but it's a class action suit uh, in light of a data breach that occurred, which allegedly exposed a lot of personally identifiable information by people that had no direct relationship with the firm. And so these would be people like whose medical records might be in a file, or e-discovery in a case may reveal a lot of this kind of stuff. And so I just thought it was kind of interesting. I guess suits like that have happened before, but it raised in my mind, when you have a business like a health insurance company, obviously you have a duty to protect the the the, the HIPAA related information and confidential information of your customers. But I have to wonder, I mean, what duty a law firm has to protect information that was probably given to it by third parties, not their information. maybe subject to some sort of confidentiality court orders or agreed orders, but it's of people that you have no relationship with, and what duty and what obligation do you have to protect that, unless it's purely statutory? Um, and of course, anytime you get into these sort of data breach kind of issues and claims, there's always standing issues, and whether these people have been harmed, and if so, how, and what's okay. So the information's been exposed, has it been used, and on and on and on. But it was interesting also because apparently the hack occurred back in 2024. The law firm didn't discover it until June of 2025, which seems like a kind of a long time. But then they didn't bother giving, I shouldn't say that. They didn't give notice until March of 2026 to all these people, which seems like, those three facts don't bode really well, I don't think, in any sort of proceeding. But you get to at the end of the day, they may defeat this claim. It's a class action claim, so there's always issues of how similar and all the claims are and all that. But you get to the end of the day, it doesn't look good for a law firm to have this kind of thing happen to them. Not to mention the time and energy and expense they're going to have to go to defeat it. And to me, it just reiterates the need for law firms to be much more diligent, cautious with this cybersecurity stuff. I mean, my experience was it was kind of the last thing management ever wanted to talk about because like it's boring, they don't understand it, and it's a cost. It's not a revenue producing thing. So, like that's just a drag on our profits. But it really, I mean, we law firms sit on some very critical and valuable information. And, my perspective still is that most firms don't take it as seriously as they need to. Maybe this will be a wake up call. So that got 4 minutes, Bob.
I thought it was really interesting. I mean, I think what's interesting about it is well, there's a lot of things that are interesting about it, but the 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 fact that these are not clients or people with sort of direct business relationships with the law firm that are bringing this suit uh, highlights the exposure beyond what probably a lot of law firms are thinking about. I don't
Right.
know. I don't know if you got more information on exactly what kind of data it was, but you can just imagine that a law firm in the course of litigation, discovery, whatever, could be getting all sorts of personal data about all sorts of people who are not their
Sure.
clients.
Right. Yeah.
And obviously, there is a duty to protect that. I mean, and the fact that it seems. I mean, first of all, I think there's probably a lot more of these cases than we ever hear about. Right? I
Right.
mean, for the most part, firms don't want you to know when it happens. And sometimes the only reason it ever happens is the data shows up on the dark web, and then somebody
Hmm.
traces it back and figures out where the data came from, and then the law firm has to talk about what happened. But the 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 fact that it took them a year to discover this breach really
Yeah.
makes you
That's
wonder what kind of systems they had in place there.
Yeah, yeah. And as you were talking, I sort of blew by the point early on, but in most lawsuits, when you produce personally identifiable information, you have a court order that requires it to be protected. And so now, like, there's probably going to be a lot of claims that the firm violated the court orders by not adequately protecting this information, which is yet another headache that they're going to have to deal with as a result of it. I mean, and and like you say, Bob, there's just tons of stuff. I mean, not just medical records, but all sorts of an IP lawsuit, IP litigation. There's all sorts of confidential stuff in there that just it's exposed. It's really problematic, and so it could be kind of a huge deal, I think.
Yeah.
particularly, I mean, if this lawsuit gets legs and goes someplace, then that's going to be then it's going to turn into a major catastrophe, I think.
Yeah. I noticed a comment in the chat about the HIPAA privacy rule applying to this, and just trying to think that through in my head because I'm not sure law firms are subject to HIPAA. They're not healthcare providers, and HIPAA only applies to healthcare providers. I know it's a kind of a loose definition of what's a healthcare
Yeah, I
provider.
think though
But I mean,
I think they have to protect the stuff. I think they're
they have to
required to
do what their
protect it.
client does, right? So
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
if they're
I guess if they're
representing,
representing,
yeah,
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 healthcare providers, yeah, I guess that would be it. This comes up a lot in I know in public records requests here in Massachusetts where I am, where some government entity will say, I can't give you those files because they're protected by HIPAA. And in fact, there have been court decisions that unless you're like an ambulance driver or something, for the most part, HIPAA doesn't apply to government entities unless they're directly providing healthcare or an ambulance driver or something like that. But some town that has records unrelated to a medical treatment or something, they're not obligated under HIPAA. But anyway, that goes.
I know one thing. If I were a client of Wiley Ryan right now, I would be seriously looking at the representations that they made with respect to confidentiality and protection of data, because just looking at the dates and the time frame,
Yeah,
got to be kind of nervous. I mean,
yeah,
yeah. So you got a lot of my stuff too.
yep. Well, we were going to talk about the M dash. We were going to have a spirited discussion about the M dash because Stephanie wrote about it this week, and I can't think of anything else I'd rather talk about. But unfortunately, Stephanie is off with Julie in Canada somewhere, I think.
yeah.
She's been kidnapped by a large language model that does not want anybody to discuss the M dash, and one of us may be gone next week.
Yeah, I don't know.
So
Yeah, no,
I think
yeah,
she
we
kind of
should.
turned the M dash on its side so it looked like that. And that's
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, it is kind of, maybe sort of, it's kind of a pet peeve of mine. It's not so much the M dash that bothers me. What bothers me is like when writers and analysts that I respect write stuff, post it on social media that you can read like three sentences and know this has got some bot to write this. They didn't spend any time whatsoever. Maybe they thought of the idea. That's about the best that you can say for it. And it's just becoming so evident when that happens. I mean, it's not like I say, like who do you think you're fooling by doing that? I can see it immediately, and it just rubs me the wrong way. I mean, maybe it's because I kind of take the time to write my own stuff and use the bots for editorial help, but I mean, and in fact, I go out of my way frequently to make sure that it doesn't sound like it's coming from an AI model, just so because I don't want people to think that it damages my credibility.
Yeah.
Although some of the people in the comments to what I said in LinkedIn didn't quite see it that way.
well,
I
I
mean,
mean,
yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just like, hey, listen, I believe in the M dash. I've always believed in the M dash. It's the line from Office Space. Why should I change? They're the ones who suck. If AI is using it, like I'm not going to stop using my M dashes over this. We do it above the law. Have a slightly different style where we don't let it get auto completed. What Word will like turn two hyphens into
Yeah.
one. The ATL style when I got there was to keep it as two dashes. So I guess we have that to distinguish it that it's not the bot.
Huh.
But yeah, no,
I just used I mean, WordPress has, you can insert the M dash character and write in WordPress.
yeah.
I mean, what we all have going for us is that we've been writing since long before Gen AI came along. So if anybody doubts our use of the our history of using the M dash, they can go back through our archives and see. I mean, I've been a long time user of the M dash, and I love the I love the M dash. I use it liberally, and I'm not going to stop using it at all. And I also do. Use it with the space on each side, and I think we
I do
talked about
too.
this on another show, but that to me that goes literally goes back to my like print journalism days because you wanted the line in the typesetting, you wanted the line to break if there was, you didn't want to have the word, then the M dash and the word without a space, because then you would have a long
The
thing like
whole.
this that wouldn't break over into the
Mhm.
next line when you're doing typesetting. So you'd always put that space in there. But
Yeah,
that's how
just
long I've been using the M dash. Remember print?
Sem
I
semicolons
always
suck,
loved
so
I
I hate
too. Yeah,
semicolons too. Yeah,
they're awful. So that's why you use dashes.
yeah.
yeah,
That's the
that's a fair
problem.
point. But it is, I
Oh,
think, a valid point, particularly for those of us that write a lot, because the more people use AI to write their material, the more that becomes sort of the accepted standard and norm. Where if you write like a human writes, like we all write, at some point it's going to shift and people are going to say, that thing Embry wrote sounds really weird. That's, what's wrong with that guy? He needs to write like, Chat GPT or something. And that's kind of worrisome.
Yeah, the homogenization of style.
Hmm. Yeah.
yeah. Well, anything else?
Don't think so.
All
I
right.
think we're running out of steam.
All right, kids, we get
Well,
to end class early.
yeah, as Tom and Ray Magliosi used to say, you've wasted another perfectly good hour of your precious time here with us today, and we appreciate it. Where's Stephanie's article? I can actually link
I'll
to
get
it.
it.
Okay, I've got it right here. If you don't,
I had
you
it.
got it.
Oh, okay,
You
you
got it.
got it. Yep.
All right, I'll drop it.
Nope. All right.
All right, whatever. We can all drop
Got
it.
it.
Yeah, read it. Read it. It's your homework. Read Stephanie's article, and next week I
We
want
will.
you all prepared to talk about the M dash with great enthusiasm. So, homework, exactly. That's right,
Yeah.
Josh.
Yeah.
So get to work. All right. Well, I appreciate everybody. Appreciate Steve and Joe, you guys. And Joe, I know it was a busy day for you, so I appreciate you making the show. And
Always.
hope to see you all here next week
All guys
with a fuller cast.
Hopefully. We'll see.
of
Bye,
characters.
everybody.
Of characters. Exactly. All right. See you. Bye.